The courtroom felt unusually heavy that morning, as if the air itself resisted movement. I pushed open the tall wooden doors, their hinges groaning loud enough to turn a few heads. I walked in with quiet, measured steps. Nothing about me was meant to draw attention. A dark jacket, a simple tie, polished but worn shoes. I looked like any ordinary man summoned as a last-minute witness, and that was exactly what I wanted everyone to believe. The room was alive with murmurs, lawyers flipping papers, journalists adjusting cameras, spectators whispering predictions about the trial. Nobody paid much attention to me at first. Not the defendant, Martin Hale, who sat slouched with a look of forced boredom. Not his overconfident attorney who didn't even glance in my direction. But when the bailiff called my name, Elias Ward, a ripple went through the gallery. A few people tilted their heads as if trying to place the familiarity of it. Most shrugged. A simple name, nothing more. Except for Judge Corbin Hayes. He was mid-sentence, lecturing the defendant about courtroom decorum, when he caught sight of me approaching the witness stand. His words evaporated. The gavel lowered slowly, stopping inches above the block. The color drained from his face so dramatically the clerks exchanged startled looks. Judge Hayes, the man known for his unshakable stoicism, suddenly looked like he'd seen something impossible, something dangerous. Our eyes met. Recognition struck him like a blow, and in that silent instant, I knew he understood everything. Why I was here, what I carried, and how my presence could unravel the life he'd built so carefully in the shadows. The courtroom had no idea, but the judge did, and that was enough to change everything. The tension in the courtroom deepened after the judge's reaction, a tension so thick you could almost hear it hum between the walls. I sat in the witness chair, feeling dozens of eyes burning into my back. Even though no one else fully understood what had just happened, they sensed the shift, like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. The prosecutor approached his lectern, flipping through his notes with a stiffness that revealed more than any expression could. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but he was aware that something unexpected had entered the room. He glanced at me, then back at Judge Hayes, as if trying to decode the invisible exchange that had just occurred. Judge Hayes attempted to regain composure. He straightened in his chair, adjusted his glasses, tapped the gavel once, not to command attention, but to calm his trembling hand. His voice, usually crisp and commanding, sounded thinner as he instructed the prosecutor to begin. My name had been written plainly on the witness list. Elias Ward. No rank, no affiliation, nothing to hint at the life I'd lived in the shadows. For months, I had erased myself piece by piece. No digital footprint, no public record movement, no traceable activity. I was a ghost by design. What the courtroom didn't know, what Judge Hayes knew all too well, was that beneath the ordinary name sat a truth sharp enough to cut through careers and reputations. I wasn't just a witness. I wasn't even just an investigator. I was the man who had spent 3 years infiltrating a web of corruption so deeply rooted that it touched judges, officers, politicians, anyone who thought themselves untouchable. And Judge Hayes had been one of them. He stared at me now with a mixture of dread and disbelief, like someone watching a buried secret claw its way to the surface. He knew that if I had come out of hiding, it wasn't by accident. It meant the evidence was ready. It meant the reckoning he'd avoided for years had finally arrived. The prosecutor asked his first question, but all attention stayed on the crack in the judge's facade. The mask he wore so confidently for decades was slipping. And I hadn't even opened my mouth yet. The prosecutor's voice steadied as he began, but only barely. Every person in the room leaned forward, sensing that whatever I was about to say would alter the case far beyond its original scope. I folded my hands on the stand, calm, controlled. The opposite of Judge Hayes, whose knuckles had turned bone white around the armrests of his chair. The first questions were routine. My name, my occupation, my connection to the defendant. I answered each one precisely, giving nothing away too early. The prosecutor, catching the rhythm, allowed the questions to build naturally. It was a dance we had practiced without ever speaking to each other. He led, and I guided him where he needed to go. Then he asked the question that opened the door. Mr. Ward, can you describe the nature of your involvement in the investigation surrounding Mr. Hale? The courtroom stilled. Even the clicking of reporters' cameras stopped. Yes, I said, my voice steady, I can. And then the truth began to unravel. I spoke of meetings held behind tinted windows, men exchanging folders in dim corridors, financial transactions masked as consulting fees. I described how evidence had mysteriously disappeared in previous hearings, evidence that only someone with direct authority over the cases could have erased. All eyes flicked toward Judge Hayes. He shifted uncomfortably, but I wasn't done. I continued, each detail slicing through the courtroom's silence like a blade. I described the conversations I'd overheard, the coded language, the favors traded behind closed doors. And then, slowly, methodically, I revealed that these deals weren't random. They formed a pattern, a network, a system. The prosecutor swallowed hard. The defense attorney's pen slipped from his hand. Martin Hale, previously dull-eyed and defeated, stared at me with growing realization. Then I delivered the final blow. I have recordings, I said quietly. Several hours' worth. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Even the judge flinched. These recordings, I continued, include phone calls and meetings with multiple individuals, one of whom is seated on the bench today. The room erupted, journalists surged forward, the bailiff shouted for order. But the damage was already done. The truth was out, and the judge's carefully constructed world had begun to collapse. Chaos rippled through the courtroom the moment my final words landed. People stood from the benches, craning their necks to see Judge Hayes' reaction. Reporters surged forward with raised microphones, shouting questions the bailiff struggled to silence. The defendant's attorney clenched his jaw, already sensing the trial had morphed into something far beyond his ability to control. But no one was unraveling faster than Judge Corbin Hayes. He attempted to maintain dignity, but his trembling hands betrayed him. He tapped the gavel again, but the sound was weak, barely a whisper compared to his usual thunderous commands. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His chest rose and fell too quickly, like someone trapped between fight and flight. "Order!" he croaked, but the word cracked midair. Then the courtroom doors at the side quietly opened. A second judge stepped in, stern, composed, wearing the black robe that symbolized unquestionable authority. Behind him, 2 federal marshals entered, their badges glinting under the harsh lights. Their presence shifted the energy instantly. The noise died down as people realized this was not a routine intervention. Judge Hayes' eyes widened in horror. He seemed to understand what their presence meant even before the announcement was made. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, facing the second judge, not Hayes. "In light of the evidence just presented and the witness's testimony, the state formally requests the immediate recusal of Judge Corbin Hayes." The marshals stepped forward. Something inside Hayes shattered. His shoulders slumped, and the last remnants of power drained from his expression. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. His lawyer whispered frantically, but Hayes didn't respond. His gaze drifted toward me. Anger, fear, betrayal, and resignation mixing into something almost pitiful. "You," he whispered, barely audible. "You were supposed to be dead." Murmurs swept the room again. I held his gaze but didn't answer. He already knew why I had survived. He knew why I had returned. When the marshals gently but firmly took him by the arms, he didn't resist. He simply lowered his head as they led him from the bench he'd ruled from for 27 years. The irony was almost poetic. A man who had condemned thousands now walked the path of the condemned. And the courtroom, once his kingdom, watched his downfall in stunned silence. When Judge Hayes was escorted out of the courtroom, a heavy silence lingered in his wake. No one moved at first. It felt as though the entire room was holding its breath, trying to grasp what had just unfolded. The fall of a man so powerful, so deeply rooted in the justice system, didn't happen every day. Certainly not in the span of 10 minutes. As the second judge assumed control and adjourned the session, reporters flooded the aisles, whispering urgently, their phones already buzzing with breaking news alerts. They were searching for me, trying to catch a glimpse, a quote, anything. But I slipped away before the first camera could swing in my direction. I exited through a narrow side corridor, one meant for staff and private legal counsel. My footsteps echoed softly, each one carrying a strange blend of relief and caution. The adrenaline that had carried me through the testimony was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache that reminded me just how long this fight had been. Outside, the city buzzed as always, cars honking, pedestrians weaving through traffic, life continuing without knowing how drastically the course of justice had shifted inside that courtroom. I walked down the steps without looking back. The cold air hit my face, grounding me. Hayes was only the beginning. His arrest would force reopenings of cases, expose forged rulings, and unravel the network he'd protected. And with him gone, others would panic. Judges, officers, officials who once believed themselves shielded by power and secrecy. My survival was the one factor none of them had accounted for. They had buried evidence, silenced witnesses, and tried to eliminate me. But I had resurfaced, carrying the truth they thought they'd destroyed. As I blended into the crowd, I felt no triumph, just purpose. This wasn't victory. This was step one. Because now that my identity was no longer hidden, every corrupt figure connected to Hayes would feel that same cold dread he felt the moment he recognized me. The reckoning had begun, and I wasn't stopping until every last one of them faced the truth.